So people are really surprised to learn that there's something actually called the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. And technically, under the law, if an alien comes to you and says, "Take me to your leader," you're supposed to take them to the director of the UNUSA, and not anybody else. I've heard tell recently, people are like, "I would take him to Elon Musk," but him or her, or whatever you want to say. But the Office of Outer Space Affairs is one of the most successful agencies in the United Nations. It is what we call the Secretariat to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which has been in effect and in force since 1958. So what have they been successful? How do we gauge that success? Space is peaceful. We haven't seen a war in space yet. We have done a really good job through UNUSA and the COPUOS in terms of keeping space. Right now, the COPUOS meets 3 times a year. The Office of Outer Space Affairs arranges those meetings, and we have more than 100 nations come together 3 times a year to talk about what they're doing in space, no matter what's happening here on Earth. We go and we talk about it. And it's an amazing experience because nations are treated equally. Ecuador, Brazil, Russia, China, the United States, everyone is equal. Everyone's vote counts, and it's a consensus system. So it's not an up and down vote. There's no opportunity for nations to bully other nations outright anyway. And so the role they play in the negotiation of a future treaty about the moon is huge because everything else gets left outside. All the terrestrial problems get left outside. In theory, of course, we're not going to escape geopolitics, but this is a forum where we can talk and where when decisions are made, it's not 54 and 49 against. It's everybody has to agree. Every single member of that Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space has the opportunity to say, "No, I don't like that language. It's not going in." So it is a really, really slow process, and a lot of people get very frustrated. For example, a lot of people are angry at the United States right now for promulgating something called the Artemis Accords, because everyone says the United States is not working in a multilateral fashion. It's supposed to work through this United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. But the problem is it takes a long time to reach consensus. And so what the United States is saying is not, it's our way or the highway. The United States is saying, hey, here's a proposal. We're not going to strong arm anybody, but we've just taken these accords and we've come up with things that are actually shore up everything in the Outer Space Treaty. And then they add things. They fill some of the gaps that were left behind because the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated at a time when all we were concerned about was peace in space. We weren't thinking about commercial space. We weren't thinking about remote sensing satellites. We weren't thinking about heritage in space. We weren't even thinking about communities on the moon. All we wanted was to make sure that that Cold War didn't transfer into orbit. And that worked really, really well. And that organization that oversaw the negotiation of that treaty is the Office of Outer Space Affairs. And that is, they will continue to play a very large role. However, you have to recognize that it's a slow process. And when countries like the United States offer some thoughts about how they're going to interpret, what they're doing is really signaling to the international community, this is where we stand. It's actually a very bold and transparent move. This is where we stand. Agree with us, disagree with us, let's talk. This is where we stand. Agree with us, disagree with us, and it's our way or the highway. So we're really trying to, the American government is really trying to jumpstart these conversations that need to be had, need to be started. And in fact, it worked. The United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space stood up a working group to look at space resource utilization. It was agreed to form the group back in September, and they will have their first formal meeting this March 2022. So it's a really exciting time. The Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space and the Office of Outer Space Affairs will always play an integral role in governance in space.
Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says essentially that no nation can claim any property rights or sovereignty over any part of outer space. Now that's a pretty broad phrase, and some would draw a distinction between, on the one hand, claiming some sort of ownership or property rights over a whole celestial body versus extracting some minerals from that celestial body without necessarily claiming any ownership over it. And the analogy that is used is when you take fish from the high seas, it's not as though you're claiming ownership over the high seas, but you are taking fish from the high seas or extracting fish from the high seas. And using that analogy, some states, some nations, such as the United States and Luxembourg and the United Arab Emirates, have taken the position that Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty does not prevent them from having property rights over extracted resources. And that's pretty important if a commercial entity, a commercial mining entity, for example, is looking for a reward for the enormous risk that they're going to take in developing the means to undertake mining operations. So it's pretty important that there is some reward for them. There is an alternate regime though. So there's another treaty known as the Moon Agreement. But the Moon Agreement doesn't have many states who are parties to the Moon Agreement. There are only 18 states who are parties to the Moon Agreement, whereas there are over 100 states who are parties to the Outer Space Treaty. So the Moon Agreement doesn't have a lot of states subscribing to the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement says that when we humanity are on the cusp of being able to undertake commercial mining of space, then those state parties to the Moon Agreement are obliged to establish an international regime. And that international regime would involve potentially, for example, some international body to give licenses, and that international body, the commercial entities, would maybe pay royalties to that international body. So there are potential analogies with minerals that could be extracted from the deep seabed as well. So there's valuable minerals there, and there are similar questions about an international body to allocate property rights in respect of minerals on the deep seabed and the paying of royalties to that body as well. That's yet to happen. It's a complex question for Australia because Australia is one of those 18 parties to the Moon Agreement. The US, though, has taken the bull by the horns, if you like. They've initiated the Artemis program, the program to send the first woman to the moon, and the next man, I think the next man of color, I think maybe is what they aim to do under the Artemis program, which is fantastic. And in conjunction with the Artemis program, NASA has proposed something called the Artemis Accords. The Artemis Accords repeat a lot of the principles that are already in the Outer Space Treaty and other space-specific treaties, but they add some very specific things. Two things that are a little bit controversial that they add. One thing is it says, the Artemis Accords say, that Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty is no bar to property rights over resources extracted from the moon or other celestial bodies. And the second thing they do is they establish the idea of safety zones around, for example, a moon station. That's a little bit controversial because if you're going to assert a safety zone, does that begin to look like an assertion of sovereignty or property or ownership over a certain area of the moon? So that's a complex issue. We need to resolve these questions in order that we can sustain human life on something like the moon station through being able to mine water for hydrogen and oxygen and to mine regolith as well for 3D printing to create structures. But in order to resolve these questions, we need to, or in order to be able to support those communities on the moon, we need to be able to resolve those questions. If you want to find out more about the space-specific treaties, the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs has all the resources there, the treaties themselves, and a bunch of other resources on the UNUSA, that's how you say it, the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, on their website. There's also another website that I would like to encourage people to have a look at. It's specific to Australia. It's called the ANGELS website, or the Australian Navigational Guide Explaining Laws for Space. and it has a very simple, straightforward explanation of laws that apply to outer space. And if you want to find out more about the Artemis Accords, then NASA has a website specifically about the Artemis program. And on that website, you can find the Artemis Accords themselves in full.